highest level, which are actually acting very much in harmony with the management. So there's actually some very romantic views on that from Western researchers very often, but in the end, yeah, strikes have come down to 78 per year now, so it's actually something that doesn't play much of a role in practice any longer. Yes, and since 2009, actually, the number has been under 100 stably. So that's in a country of about 126 million, so it's really not playing much for practice. And that's all strikes, it's not just essential services. And as they're stressing actually in the account also is that there's no statistics at all about essential services, which is quite interesting because actually there is a notification obligation for essential services. So you should know the number, but interestingly enough, that number is above 100 usually, several hundreds. So there's much more applications than strikes actually taking place in practice. So that's also something that limits our possibility of even studying that country. So that a bit as a kind of a background. Very low level of strike in general and not much for research, not much of an interest actually in researching that. Yes, I might skip these points now in order to save some time, so they spend quite a large part of the paper in order to describe when a strike is legal in general in Japan, where, well, the general conditions, they are quite tight in some areas. So, for example, no wildcat strikes, no political strikes, no supportive strikes, solidarity strikes, things like that. So it's kind of relatively narrowly concentrated. And the consequences are, of course, if you stick to these rules, then they are, again, quite similar to international standards. So you're protected from criminal and from also civil responsibility, protected from discrimination, protected from dismissal, things like that. So actually, they are well protected if they fulfill the requirements, and, well, if they're not fulfilling them, then, well, everything's possible, tort claims, dismissal, and so on. But this all stays at a very theoretical level, actually. So they don't give many examples, and probably the background of that is that it's simply not happening too often. Yes, so when we now come to what is really, well, important for the area of essential services, then the one parallel with Germany probably is that there's this sweeping prohibition of strike in the public sector. And that's true for what they call non-industrial public employees, but also for the industrial public employees. So that's what they term people working for public companies, basically. So they are not really civil servants, but they are in the public sector. And non-industrial public employees, so the real civil servants, are actually very highly restricted in their collective rights. They can't even conclude collective agreements, whereas the industrial ones can basically, but in practice this is also very limited because the wages are determined by legislation, so they can't bargain about their wages. Yes, and there has been some reform debate in the past about that, or to liberalize that a bit, but they're stressing that the current government is not going ahead with this, so the debate is actually stopped.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but was there a definition of what constitutes a non-industrial public employee?
Well, they don't give a real definition of that. I understood it in the way that these are the kind of the employees of government institutions, of administrative institutions, what I would say is like civil servants in the classical sense. And the industrial ones are working for public companies, which are kind of owned by the state, but more working like private. Yeah. So they use these terms. Yeah. Don't really explain it. It's more or less my understanding. So my apologies for not being able to explain that. It's just my understanding. Yeah. So at the moment, there seems to be a relatively little scope for amending most of these rules. In the private sector, there's actually not many real prohibitions. So the only ex-ante prohibition would be actions that endanger human life. So that's actually not too broad. For the others, there's just a notification obligation if it touches what they call public welfare undertakings. And public welfare undertakings, they generally describe as something, well, that touches the public interest. So that's very close to what we are talking about as essential services, really. And there's a few sectors that are generally considered public welfare undertakings, like we have them here, transportation, post, telecommunications, etc. But there's also the possibility for the ministry to decide on specific undertakings that they provide, like these public welfare services. And here again, interestingly, it's not just about like things like health or well-being of the population, it's also about the national economy. So here again, something that clearly goes beyond what the ILO would consider like protecting really essential interests. Yeah. Anyway, this is just a notification obligation, so it does not prevent these people from striking. But what can follow from this, as we know about them from the notification, there might be an emergency adjustment then. And this is again decided by the ministry. So if they get to know about the strike through the notification, they might then decide that in the individual case, we suspend the strike. So it may be suspended for 50 days after the publication to the public. And yeah, then the whole thing would go to arbitration. And really,
there is arbitration here?
Well, they might initiate that. That's not like in the public sector. They would have like compulsory arbitration, but they would try to, yeah, solve the issue. And
because this reminds me of the American national emergency. This one, the emergency adjustment, is very similar to what you have in the national emergency disputes. Suspension of the strike for some days in order to enable the parties to negotiate.
Yes, but it seems like it's rarely used in Japan, and it's also
Yes.
fairly rarely used in the U.S.
Now, but not in the past.
Well, yes, in the past. It's only the presidential power to enjoin a strike for emergency powers is only been used twice in the U.S.
Okay, so that is really similar because in Japan it's been used once, the whole history, and that's like 65 years ago. It's not something that's happening in practice. You might say it's actually a very strike-friendly country in theory, but of course the real background of this might be that there are simply no strikes going on that have to be prohibited. So it's, of course, again, law on the ground might be something very different.
Yeah, but in '73 they had many strikes and still it was not used.
Yeah, and the
12,000 strikes and.
Yeah. The interesting thing is that at that period, actually, also the courts seemed to decide more in favor of the unions, more in favor of strikes, and afterwards the political climate simply changed too much. And that's what we have ended up with. But at the moment, there's simply a very strong anti-labor sentiment that also has to do with history. Yeah, so for a specific case, for electricity supply, there's a specific legal rule saying that anything that hampers electricity supply for the country is also prohibited. So that's only in this very one sector. That was also a reaction to strikes in the past, like really causing big chaos, and it has come to the public discussion again now with the Fukushima disaster a few years ago, but there's not been a substantial extension of that yet, so it's really relatively narrow. For the other areas, there's no real prohibition.
But it has to do with the 2015? It's related to the electricity supply? The guidelines?
Yeah,
no.
These guidelines actually limit the scope of this law, saying it's not a general prohibition, it should only be used ad hoc. So these workers may go on strike unless the ministry issues a declaration that they should not. So that's actually liberalizing the whole thing a bit more. Yeah, so it's more practical development. Coming out to the compensatory measures for the non-industrial public employees, there's actually the compensatory mechanism that is seen for them is that their wages are defined by law, and legislature is obliged to raise their wages in accordance with what happens in the private economy. That's also like exercised every year. So there's this commission or personnel agency doing research on like the mean wage increase in the private economy, and then gives a recommendation to the parliament, and usually their wages are simply raised just in accordance with that. So that's considered to be their means of profiting also from the general economy. So if in the private sector, people or private workers are able to raise their wages, then public employees will also benefit from that. Nothing beyond that, so no real own possibility to influence their wages. As for the industrial public employees, so like the employees of the public companies, there is conciliation and mediation procedures that are being set up by the Labor Relations Commissions. And if for 2 months these mediation procedures are not successful, then mandatory arbitration can be initiated by either of the parties. So here actually we have a different settlement mechanism that would replace then the right to strike for these workers. In the private sector, there's no specific mechanism to replace it, but of course in the private sector also we don't have these real prohibitions that we have.
Why electricity?
In the electricity area, that's probably also why they issued these guidelines in order to give them a limited right to strike in the end. Yes, so that's basically it. The conclusion for that would be that, first of all, there are extensive restrictions, especially in the public sector, of course. That goes far beyond what the ILO would consider an appropriate level of limiting the right to strike, because we're generally not asking, is it essential services, to what degree is really important for the public interest. There is just a sweeping prohibition. And the recent debate that has occurred being stifled by the last government, which is again more a right-wing government, which doesn't have much of a favor of changing legislation. Yes, and generally, of course, we can say that this very low level of strikes doesn't give us much of a basis for discussing the situation on the ground, and it's relatively difficult to go without data even on how often strikes in essential services are really occurring. Yeah, so that would be more or less the 2 points that one could conclude of that report. And yeah, I'm happy to hear your questions and maybe forward them. I'm not going to be able to answer them.
Well, I read the paper. It's a very well-written paper, a pleasure to read. And I have just one question which we can transmit to the authors. What wasn't really clear to me is the theoretical reason of the limit to strike for the industrial public employees that are employees of companies that are owned by the state. So I don't understand the reason that's behind this limitation, given that these subjects are present in the market at the same way as private entrepreneurs are in the market. So I get the reason why non-industrial public employees don't have the right to strike. Probably is a reason similar to the Beamten limit we have discussed with Monica before. What I don't get from the paper, and probably they should help us a bit more. Second point.
Yeah. Well, my impression was, of course, that the wages of these employees are also decided by law, actually, and they are actually benefiting from public means. So the idea is that, like, they
taxes,
shouldn't
but
they shouldn't strike because
but I don't link the public support. Well, they don't have European Union, but I don't link the public support with the fact these are enterprises in the market. So something I missed something.
Yeah.
Because these are.
But what I missed in the presentation, I haven't read the report of the law in action, and not about speaking about today, but even today, even with 100 strikes, can be that some of the strikes are in essential services, and the question is really what is going on in this country, what is the case law, what is the compliance, what happened, all the things that are really of interest for a study like law in action, and maybe it's something that we should ask them to try and bring to the fore. Because when you do law in action, and I think this is related to probably to everyone, we have to go beyond what we read in the law and go to different reports and maybe speak with people and who are main actors in industrial labor relation and collective bargaining area and to really know what's going on, because this is what's so important. Look in what is written in the law, will not really have a clue of what's going really, and we know it from, I think everyone who was involved in a strike knows that when you are in a strike, the law is there and you strike under the shadow of the law, but what's going on is not really the law. It's what's going on is a lot of other things that have impact on the parties and their decision and the negotiation that goes, the internal and out, external negotiation, and the second table and all the rest. And this is what we want to capture in this kind of study. And I think we should also, we record the discussion here for our colleagues from Japan, and it's something that I think they should add to the report.
Generally, very, very few court cases in Japan. So there are generally so very few court cases in Japan, specifically on all kind of collective labor relations. So they would probably also provide low numbers, and maybe they are dating back to the 1980s or something like that. So that's my experience.
Maybe because I come from a country where we have so many cases, I think we do now some reorganization and restructuring of our electricity, and I think it was in court maybe 50 times, just this one single. Am I right about it? At least 50, maybe between 50 and 100 times.
I didn't count, but in general, different parts, different variations of the same case have been dealt with in different levels of the labor court in the past, I think,
In the Supreme Court.
and in the Supreme Court recently in the past maybe 10 years, 2005.
The reform is 20 years old, but in the last 5 years, it was in the court at least 50 times. 50 different level of courts, just in one restructuring of the electricity, of electric supply.
Lawyers, they're all have to be kept busy.
Yes, Joe.
Just following up on Modi's point as a general matter for everybody, and this is not a question about Japan, but Canada and Denver specifically in the last couple of decades, you said the same thing about Japan based on their report. I'm going to say the same thing about the U.S. Curiosity, are there any people here from a country where these strike rates have been going up in the last couple of decades? Okay.
Will be in Italy?
No. Well,
Down?
the private sector is down, but you can understand it. There was the crisis, people don't have jobs, so I mean, who
And
has
in the
jobs?
public sector?
The public sector, there are some differences. Well, you have to consider that since 2010, we don't have any wage increase in the public sector. No increases, okay? So we have, relatively speaking, more strikes than in the private, but if you look at trend at the end of the paper, there is something a page of numbers, so it's going down a bit.
And with us, of course, it's the specialized unions that tend to give more strikes. So we have had this change in the composition of union representation, and the new ones, they want to enter the market in a sense by making very high demands. Some of those specialized unions started off with pay-raising demands of 35%. They didn't get it in the end, but that is a way of mobilizing potential future constituency, and that is what they did. And so, yes, we have. It is, of course, usually a very punctual description of the situation. That was the case in 2015. We don't see it now. So, but anyway, all in all, there was an increase.
This is the niche, what Monica referred to as the niche union phenomena in Germany. And this is where all the strikes all of them were in essential services, by the way. This was the train drivers and pilots and doctors. All of them formed this.
Illegal actions, right. Oh, you gotta put them in strike rates in general, so Brazil, Germany, and Russia.
France.
And France also rates from, okay, so.
I mean, here for Japan, probably I also forgot to mention that it's also important to know that people who are not member of the union are not allowed to strike. So the union also has no possibility to mobilize really a large number of people because the unionization rates are really low. So there's only very few companies where you really have unions. In all the others, you have no possibility of ever organizing a strike because it's really limited to these unions. So it's kind of, there's not even the possibility of legal strikes really developing like that. There might be illegal ones, but also that the research interest seems to be really, really low.
Just to go back, if we can, briefly to Adriana's paper, what's really happening within the UK is a massive growth in informal labour. So independent contractors and forms of contracting out. And under our legislation, there are no protections of statutory immunities if you're not a worker taking industrial action. So what's happening in Italy is interesting in terms of the capacity for strikes through WhatsApp, because that is happening spontaneously with some workers, and you're actually protected from dismissal, and there's no likelihood of action being taken against you. There's no formal requirements for taking industrial action in terms of tort liability, but for independent contractors who possibly most need this, they don't.
Well, a relevant case of independent contractor on strike was the taxi driver recently striking against the Uber new competition. You know, so this is you say these are not employees; these are independent contractors, taxi drivers. They should apply the regulation of strike and essential services, which means they have the freedom to protest, suspending the work, but we are not discussing about the right to strike. Because frankly, they're not employees, they don't have. Okay, and they fall under that.
The lawyers in Italy, because they wanted that only lawyers would be mediators. So in order to protect their turf against the mediation law in Italy, they went on strike. So there is no question they are not employees, but they use the strike as a voice mechanism. It's
a voice mechanism, yes.
It's completely different paradigm. What is the strike there?
Yes, you got it.
I got it. Competition law. Long last.
Yes, we would be hit by competition law. So the difficulty is if taxi drivers in the UK did that and you could trace their communications, they'd have to use something like Instagram or Snapchat where it disappears quickly. But with WhatsApp, you could still be caught on screenshot. That could be, it would fall foul of competition law.
But we don't have it.
But we don't have any actions.
No. Yeah. Well, on trains, you don't have a lot of my train. You have action in transport, trade transport.
So we have a lot of action. We have very good activist unions. So, what you were saying about your professional unions, wow, rail unions, especially the RMT, have been so activist and so good at getting what they want for their clients and their members that, they have a huge wage premium on the basis of their actions.
Okay, we have now a short coffee break. Okay. And then we come to Poland and Russia.
It's putting on what?
So what happens with the informal economy of Brazil?
It's getting bigger.
It's getting bigger still. And I mean, what happens about application of informal is there an attempt to use assistance by workers within that sector? Or is it just
No, they just passed a bill statute change a lot of things on the whole scenario. One of the things they are trying to do is to incorporate these people who are on the informal market in order to see as legal.
Is this for tax purposes and revenue purposes?
Yeah. And also to figures related to employment, to say that, you know, we don't have a unemployment problem.
But